Hi friends, today we have an incredibly difficult and tragic story that makes it hard to remain indifferent. Imagine a normal school day where kids are laughing, socializing, and everything seems to be going their way. But behind this apparent normalcy lies a dark story filled with anger and prejudice. The story of a boy whose hatred was so strong that he decided to commit a terrible act to try to poison his black classmate just because of the color of his skin. But fate had it differently. A teacher got in his way and noticed that something was wrong and contained the tragedy, preventing it from unfolding in full force. That was just the beginning. The next thing that happened shook the whole class and made everyone realize what true justice is and what it means to fight racism. If this story makes you think or evoke strong emotions, write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. We want to know. Our audience. That each of you is important to us. Each comment helps us to grow and promote such important topics on our channel. It is you, dear viewers, who are our strength and motivation to keep telling such difficult stories. A sunny morning at the middle school began as it always did. Children rushed to their classrooms, smiling and laughing, sharing the latest news and gossip. Smell of freshly brewed coffee and delicious pastries from the bakery attracted attention, and the hallways were filled with cheers and friendly teasing. The melodies of school bells mingled with the friendly chorus of teenagers, creating an atmosphere of warmth and serenity. At first glance, it seemed like this day was no different from the previous ones. In the classrooms, teachers explained the material, and students took notes, focused on their studies. But beneath this shell of normality lurked an invisible threat, lurking in one corner of this familiar world. In the classroom Saturday, a black boy named Michael. He was the favorite of his teachers and peers, smart and kind, but there were shadows in his life for a long time. Prejudiced looks, whispers behind his back, and ridicule that no one wanted to talk about out loud. He had many successes to his credit, but even they could not fully protect him from the hatred that grew like a weed among the students. It was on this day, in a circle of cheerful chaos, in a corridor full of life, that one boy caught sight of him, clutching a sinister idea he had long nurtured. His hatred was hidden behind a mask of indifference, and the laughter of those around him seemed unbearable. This day, full of normality, was a harbinger of the irreparable. Subscribe to Depot Pro to edit this document. Visit www.depot.com divided by Pro for more information. As usual, no one noticed how hatred, like a poisonous root, sprouted in the depths of the school. No one could have imagined that behind the tinsel of ordinary life lay so much darkness ready to creep out into the light. At the moment when the world seemed serene, bias whispered its sinister intentions, preparing for its crime. The events that unfolded that day will shock everyone, and even those who turn away from reality will not be able to avoid facing the horror. On that school morning, full of innocence, a tragedy is brewing that will change the lives of many forever. Michael Saturday at his desk, preparing for another lesson, his friendly smile shone in the classroom like a ray of sunshine. He was always ready to help others, whether he was explaining a difficult topic or supporting a friend in a difficult moment. With his bright eyes and infectious laugh, he gathered his friends around him, and it seemed that nothing bad could happen to him. But there was an anxiety lurking inside him. He felt that someone was watching his back, and this knowledge deprived him of peace. His aggressor, Tony, was the opposite of Michael. Tony's gaze was filled with animosity, and his behavior at times betrayed strong prejudicial attitudes. He always chose his victims, never hesitating to show his hatred, and unfortunately, Michael was his target. Tony had a reputation as a bully. He wasn't interested in learning or friendship. Instead, he fed off the fear and vulnerability of others, building his life on humiliation and pain. Outwardly, Tony looked like an ordinary guy, athletic, with a self-assured smile that could fool many people. But behind this shell lurked anger and jealousy that drove him to do terrible things. His hatred of black boys grew like a sinister seed, eventually bearing fruit in the form of aggression. Michael had noticed Tony looking at him with contempt on more than one occasion, but had tried to ignore it. He had hoped that perhaps in time the hatred would settle on its own, but each time he crossed Tony's path, his hopes were dashed. Michael had many friends, but he felt that with each passing day, my fear came closer and the hate grew stronger. That day, while everyone around them was laughing and enjoying the moments, there was this invisible struggle going on. Michael felt more vulnerable than ever and didn't realize that Tony, with his angry energy, was already preparing his next move. This moment between the two boys, filled with laughter and hatred, was already foreshadowing a tragedy that no one realized. And when the time came to act, Tony's malice was revealed in the most horrific light, leaving only fear and destruction behind. Two worlds, full of life and evil, were about to collide, and their fates would intertwine on that fateful day. The depressed atmosphere in the classroom grew more and more palpable with each passing day. Michael, though he tried to remain optimistic, couldn't ignore the sullen looks Tony threw at him, the sarcasm of his comments about his appearance, his clothes, and even the way he spoke echoed through the hallways like a quiet whisper, but grew more sinister each time. "Hey Michael, don't you know your shirt looks like it was picked up at a thrift store?" Tony pronounced, eliciting laughter from his friends. While the class laughed, many failed to notice how this animosity, disguised as a joke, was tightening its net around Michael. Every jab, every taunt added a heaviness to his heart, despite the fact that teachers were supposed to monitor classroom behavior. Such incidents went unnoticed. Pay attention to the tension between the children. You could catch a glimpse of Michael beginning to isolate himself, slowly pulling his thoughts away whenever Tony opened his mouth. It wasn't just a matter of words, it was a struggle in which Michael felt increasingly alone and vulnerable. The aggressor became more persistent and his actions became more aggressive. He found moments to ridicule Michael even on their social media group. "Someone needs to tell Michael that he can't play on our team until he learns to behave normally," he wrote, while the students, responding ironically, cheered him on. Each of these jokes seemed to leave marks on Michael that no one could see. His shoulders hunched and his smile grew smaller. He tried to maintain his normalcy, but the inner conflict continued to grow like poison ivy around his heart. But even in these moments, when Michael felt lost, there was still hope that someone would notice what was happening. He dreamed that someone, whether it was a teacher or a classmate, would tell Tony that his words were not a joke, but real hatred. But until that happened, Michael continued to relive each day, waiting for a miracle that would restore his confidence and joy. There was silence in the classroom, as if everyone knew Tony was preparing his next attack. The morning classes went on as usual, but the tension in the air was building. Everyone knew about Tony's evil jokes, but few dared to intervene. Everyone, including the teachers, seemed enchanted into silence, letting hatred spread through the classroom like a black shadow. At recess, as the students gathered in groups, Tony approached Michael, his eyes sparkling with contempt. "Say, Michael, when are you going to realize that not everyone in this school has to be your friend?" he said with a sneer, eliciting muffled laughter from his buddies. "Why would you try to fit in with our team? We don't take anyone who doesn't look like us." The words reverberated like a sharp blade, penetrating Michael's soul. He felt tears coming to his eyes, but shame kept him from crying. Around him, the friends who had once supported him now only looked on, avoiding his gaze as if searching for a way not to interface. Tony continued to attack, emphasizing the difference in their appearance. "Tell me, Michael, how does it feel to be black in a white world? Doesn't it bother you that you'll be second to class forever?" He scoffed, while the other classmates averted their eyes. Some of them whispered, discussing how cruel and mean-spirited Tony's words could be, but no one dared to stand up for him. Misunderstanding and fear plagued their hearts. With each new comment, Tony's hatred became more and more obvious. "Why, don't you dye yourself white to blend in a little with your surroundings?" He threw into the air, and laughter swept through the classroom again like a somber chorus. Those words, full of venom, echoed, filling the space with hatred and prejudice. Michael gritted his teeth, feeling the anger boiling up inside him, but he couldn't allow himself to respond. He knew that any resistance would only make things worse. Loneliness and bitterness enveloped him, and he realized that his classmates' prejudice was turning him into an isolated victim and Tony into an unpunished bully. From that moment on, Michael became not just an object of ridicule, but a symbol of how flippant most people were about racism. His hatred, cloaked in laughter, formed a dark atmosphere among his classmates, and none of them were willing to break the cycle. Each new taunt was a step toward the tragedy that seemed inevitably approaching. Tony, replaying every jab, every taunt in his head, realized that humiliating Michael wasn't enough. Every day the hatred inside him only grew, pushing him to more radical actions. He didn't just want his victim to suffer, he needed her to know she couldn't escape the humiliation. Sitting at his desk in class, he thought about how his fear and prejudice could be used as a weapon. The idea that came to his mind was not only sinister, but insanely dangerous. Tony began to plan how he could deliver Michael not just verbal humiliation, but something more gruesome that would leave a mark on his soul forever. While the classroom was filled with carefree laughter, thoughts of how he could use the poisonous substances were brewing in Tony's mind. He imagined mixing up some sort of wretched powder to slip into Michael's lunch. The thought of what it might do to his health didn't make him feel any sympathy, just the joy of imagined revenge. Tony continued to hatch this plan, increasingly lost in his desire to cause Michael terror and fear. Why don't I put something in his food that will let him know how much he's not wanted here? He thought, imagining how he would laugh as he watched his victim react to his atrocity. In his mind, the idea was becoming more and more appealing, and his hatred only fueled his dark thoughts. It wasn't just a plan, it was the manifesto of his hatred, a culmination of a hatred that seemed to terrify the world around him. And Tony felt like the master of the situation. Instead of stopping and realizing where his evil scheme could lead, he only went deeper into his plan, losing all sense of morality and humanity. Now that hatred had turned into action, he was preparing to take his aggression to the next level, creating a disaster that would scar not only Michael, but the entire school. The shadow of impending tragedy became more and more apparent, and a victim, unaware of what was going on behind her back, continued to live peacefully, immersed in her worries and dreams. While her threat increased, several days passed, and the dark shadow of the impending deed became more and more apparent to Tony. His dreams of hurting Michael filled his thoughts. Every night, behind the closed doors of his room, he went over the details of his plan in his head, which made him both excited and gloating. Tony thought out the details carefully, looking for ways that no one could suspect him. After all, it's only Michael, he told himself, forgetting that behind every sacrifice was a human life full of hopes and dreams. To him, Michael became a symbol of everything that irritated him. Distinction, he thought, a superiority he could never attain. Tony began gathering the items he needed, knowing that the more thoroughly he prepared, the better chance he had of not getting caught. He found some old medications and some chemicals in his father's medicine cabinet that he thought might serve him as a poisoning agent. This preparation gave him a sense of power, and he imagined with greedy satisfaction watching his classmates suffer. If he experiences what I feel, the world will be a little fairer, he pondered as his eyes glowed with hatred. Every time he thought of Michael, his anger only grew, and with it grew the desire to inflict physical pain. He imagined him falling from his gift, his classmates watching in horror at what was happening, and it only fueled his aggression. Every step toward the realization of the plan filled Tony with gloating, but at the same time an oppressive fear of what might happen if he were caught tormented him. This internal contradiction was creating a storm in him. He didn't know if it could stop at words when the time came to act. In fact, his hatred for Michael was growing into more than just a desire to humiliate. It had become a desire to inflict pain that could turn into real aggression. Images of the disaster he would witness were already forming in his mind. This darkness that filled his soul gave him strength, but at the same time it pulled him down into the abyss from which there was no return. In the end, all these preparations horrified the very essence of human life. His hatred for the color of Michael's skin turned into an urgent need to prove his superiority. Tony was not just preparing for a crime, he was striving to create a moment that would not just leave a mark on his memory, but would rip all hope and faith in justice from his victim's heart. The sun was shining brightly in the sky as the students, eager for recess, ran out of the classroom to enjoy their moments of freedom. Laughter and joyful shouts were in the air, but in one corner of the schoolyard there was a very different atmosphere. Tony hid behind his desk, feeling the adrenaline pounding in his temples. This moment was the culmination of his elaborate plan. and at last he was preparing to carry out his sinister idea. He had a small packet of powder that he had mixed with chemicals he had found at his parents' house. It was a dangerous substance that, in small doses, could make one very sick. Tony watched as Michael, socializing with his friends, rapidly made his way to the lunch table. At that moment, an evil grin appeared on his face, and his heart beat faster with excitement and hatred. Michael didn't realize the threat looming over him. He was full of hope for a normal day, just like before, and the treat he had chosen was nothing more than a simple lunch. With his friends laughing and joking, he paid no attention to Tony, who was sneaking around the table while no one was watching. As everyone around them laughed and discussed plans for the weekend, Tony slowly and carefully opened the package. He slipped the dangerous powder into Michael's food container, savoring the feeling of power. This insidious operation was more than just cruelty. It was the culmination of his hatred, an effort to show that he, as a white boy, had a right over a black classmate. "You learn today that the world isn't such a friendly place," he said quietly as he watched his victim nonchalantly pack his lunch. His heart was pounding with excitement, and his mind was racing with thoughts of how hard it would be for Michael to live through the consequences of his atrocity. After he had finished his dastardly mission, Tony quickly returned to his company, joining in the conversation about soccer and new games. Joy raged inside him, mixed with excited anticipation. He knew he would soon see his plan begin to come to fruition. Michael, unaware of the betrayal, returned to his friends, sitting down at the table. Full of hope, Tony felt all the aggression, all the malicious intentions overwhelm him as he looked at his classmate while he happily started his lunch. This wasn't just an attempted poisoning. It was a dark act of hatred, driven by racism that carried a hunger for pain and fear. The climax of this dangerous game was approaching, and while the tension was building, no one had any idea what was about to happen. At this moment, when evil was about to prevail, beneath the thick childlike carelessness lurked something terrible that would change the lives of many. Amidst the general laughter and bustle, the teacher, Mr. Smith, sensed that something in the atmosphere of the schoolyard had changed. He had always been attentive to his students, and even in his most carefree moments, his instincts compelled him to watch the behavior of his charges. On this day, his attention was drawn to Tony, who seemed to be tense even for a normal recess. As soon as he noticed Tony watching Michael from afar, Mr. Smith squinted his eyes. He had a hunch that there was more going on between them than just the usual school feud. Tony had always been known for his sarcastic jokes and teasing, but now there was a malice in his eyes that worried the teacher. While Michael, unsuspecting, chatted quietly with his friends, Tony was hiding behind the desk with a dangerous glint in his eyes, preparing to execute his plan. Mr. Smith decided he couldn't just ignore the situation. He moved closer, trying to pick up on the conversations and atmosphere around him. "What's going on?" he whispered to himself as he noticed Tony leaning over Michael's lunch. An inner voice told him to intervene. He knew that innocent smiles sometimes hid darker intentions. Mr. Smith, frowning his eyebrows, began to observe the situation without giving away his presence. He noticed Tony slipping something into Michael's food, and his heart beat faster. At that moment, he realized that he had witnessed something that could turn into a real tragedy. The teacher, remembering recent incidents at school when racism and aggression went beyond words, realized that the situation required immediate intervention. He stepped forward determinedly, ready to intervene, when he saw Michael pick up his spoon without realizing what awaited him. Inside Mr. Smith, feelings of anger and anxiety were fusing. He couldn't let hatred get the upper hand. This moment could have been a turning point, not only for Michael, but for the entire school. He knew he had an opportunity to stem this tide of aggression and show his students that no bias or racial differences could be justified. A determined look appeared on his face with each passing moment. As he approached the table, he realized that he had become the last barrier between good and evil, and that his actions at this moment would determine not only Michael's fate, but also the state of their school. As Mr. Smith approached the table, his heart pounded in anticipation. It was as if time had slowed, and he saw Michael, unsuspecting, raise his spoon to his lips. Tony, hiding his aggression behind a mask of indifference, watched with dark joy "No, stop, Mr. Smith said loudly, reaching out and intercepting the spoon from Michael's hands before he could take a bite. His voice was full of power and insistence, drawing the attention of the entire class. Michael, dumbfounded, stopped and looked at the teacher in bewilderment. "What's going on, Mr. Smith?" he asked, not realizing exactly what had happened. Tony, on the other hand, turned pale, realizing that his evil scheme had been revealed, but there was no remorse or fear on his face. The teacher, sensing danger, quickly snatched the food container from Michael and eyed the contents suspiciously. "Tony, what did you do?" he asked, shifting his gaze to his student, who tried to appear innocent. But the teacher's eyes reflected righteous fury. Mr. Smith knew that Tony was the one involved in this situation, and it didn't take him long to connect the facts. He carefully opened the package and, checking carefully, found the same mixture there that Tony had slipped into his food. A poison that could do serious harm filled his thoughts with dread. Tony, realizing that his plan had failed, tried to excuse himself. "I was only joking, Mr. Smith. It's not that serious." But there was fear in his voice, and he could not hide his anxiety, for at that moment everyone around him suddenly realized the seriousness of the situation. "This isn't a joke, Tony," Mr. Smith said with cold calmness. "You're playing with other people's lives. I'm not going to let something like that happen in our class." His voice sounded determined, and he knew he had to act immediately. The teacher turned to Michael, who looked shocked and frightened. "Michael, you're safe. I won't let anyone hurt you." The phrase was a comfort to him. While the atmosphere of the classroom was filled with tension, the events unfolded so rapidly that the whole class was shocked by what was happening. Some of the boys began to whisper, while others looked on with wide open eyes. Everyone understood that they were on the verge of a real catastrophe, and only Mr. Smith's intervention saved the situation from imminent disaster. At that moment, it was obvious that the teacher had become not only Michael's protector, but also a guardian of justice. He was ready to stand up for his students, despite the risk of facing the aggression and hatred that seemed to overwhelm the class. Michael, still sitting at the table, felt a cold sweat cover his forehead. He looked at Mr. Smith, who was holding the container of food. While his thoughts swirled around what had just happened, his legs felt like they had become absorbent cotton, and he couldn't realize how close he was to real danger. Tony's voice still echoed in his head, his angry taunts and sullen glances that seemed to take on a new frightening meaning now. The words that Tony had thrown in his direction throughout his schooling were filled with renewed vigor. "You're not like us," he remembered, and every time the boy said it, his voice sounded more and more hateful. Now it wasn't just empty words, it was a reality that could lead to his demise. The thought that someone could have done something so horrible came over him like a wave, making him feel fear and hatred at the same time. Michael looked at his classmate, who seemed to feel not an ounce of remorse, only fear that his evil plan had been exposed. A new wave of anger mixed with bewilderment erupted inside him. How could someone hate someone so much that they were willing to do harm? He could feel the resentment building, and a struggle between the desire to understand this hatred and the fear of what it could do flared up in his soul as the teacher continued to explain what had happened and how it was unacceptable. Michael just sat there, unable to believe his ears, still in shock. He couldn't imagine being threatened in such a way, and couldn't even believe that he was the victim of racism, which he had once considered something distant. Now it was no longer just an abstract concept, but his personal reality. How could this have happened? He asked himself, trying to find an explanation for Tony's hatred. This feeling of sudden betrayal had left a deep mark on his heart. He had always tried to be kind, friendly, and tolerant, but now that his life had almost been attempted, he had to realize that people's cruelty could be completely unlimited. Michael realized that he would have to relive the experience, but the pain of betrayal still lived inside him. He felt fear creep up his spine. If it happened now, what would happen next? This moment that was supposed to be a normal day at school turned into a real nightmare. In that moment, surrounded by his peers, Michael suddenly felt very alone. He knew that this experience would change him forever, and now that he was in such a vulnerable state, he needed to find his strength. He couldn't let hate gain the upper hand, not in his heart, not in his life. The assembled students still in shock at what had happened. Frowncy as Mr. Smith, clutching a container of food, turned to the class. He felt it was time to expose Tony's true colors, to show everyone what kind of hatred racism could lead to, and to make everyone realize the seriousness of the situation. "Dear students," he began, his voice full of determination, "today I witnessed not just an act of aggression, but a true crime. This was not just a joke, it was an attempt to harm another person because of the color of their skin." His words were spoken with such force that it became clear to the class that this was no ordinary proceeding, but a moment for them to realize the consequences of hate. Tony, realizing that his atrocities were now laid bare, tried to defend himself. "That's not true. I didn't mean to kill him." But his words sounded pathetic, like an attempt to save himself when the whole room witnessed his true nature. "You put poison in Michael's food," Mr. Smith continued, ignoring Tony's protests. "You decided. You had the right to decide who was worthy of life and who wasn't, and for that you will not be forgiven." The class looked at Tony with horror and bewilderment. Some students whispered among themselves, not believing what they were hearing. The teacher's words acted like a cold shower. They realized how sinister prejudice and hatred could be, and how easily it could turn into something dangerous. Tony, who had always been just an aggressive but harmless bully to them, now appeared in his true colors as a man willing to take extreme measures. "Racism is not a joke," Mr. Smith stated, addressing the entire class. "It is a serious issue that affects all of us. We need to stand together and fight hate. We can't let it be the norm." His passionate speech lit a spark among the students, and they began to realize the importance of their actions and words. Michael, who had been watching everything that was happening, felt courage begin to crowd out his fear. He realized that his life had changed the moment Mr. Smith had spoken up for him. Now he needed to find his strength and use that experience to fight the hatred that he had seen could exist even among those he considered friends. The class split into two sides, those who supported Tony and those who, inspired by the teacher's actions, decided to stand for justice. On the faces of many of the students could be seen not only horror, but determination. They realized that they now had to do something not only for their own sake, but also for the sake of those who, like Michael, had been victimized by bias and hatred. Thus, this exposure to Tony was not only a lesson to him, but also a powerful reminder to the entire class of what they must do in the future to never let something like this happen. As soon as the tension in the classroom had subsided a little, the students began to gather in groups, discussing the incident. Whispering, they exchanged opinions, and it soon became obvious that not everyone shared Tony's condemnation. Some, not realizing the seriousness of what had happened, brought up topics that caused Michael new waves of fear and anxiety. "I don't understand why he got so upset," one of the girls pronounced, sitting at the table with her friends. "It may have been a bit harsh, but he brought the hate on himself somehow, didn't he?" The words, full of indifference, pierced the atmosphere like a knife. The smiles on the girls' faces faded, and Michael felt his heart clench with pain. "Yeah, I heard him laughing at him too," another student added. "Maybe Tony just didn't know he'd get that far. We all have jokes we regret later." Such comments made Michael freeze, as it only confirmed his fears that bias and hatred still existed. In the classroom, with each new comment, the feeling of betrayal grew stronger. Some of the students, who had been mere acquaintances, now showed their true nature. There was a sense of reproach in their words, as if it were Michael's own fault for being the victim of aggression. It was as if they had forgotten that he was a human being with dreams and feelings, and not just an object for ridicule and cruel jokes. The classmates who made such comments imperceptibly created a cocoon around themselves that protected them from understanding the reality of the situation. Their words showed that racism is not always expressed in open hatred. Sometimes it is hidden under a mask of indifference or jokes. Michael, listening to them talk, felt tears come to his eyes. "Doesn't anyone realize how serious this is?" he thought. And although Mr. Smith had clearly become his advocate, the question remained, how could he deal with those who shared these views, and what should he do about this hatred that seemed to still hang in the air, despite his desire for friendship and understanding? Complex emotions overwhelmed him, and he realized that the situation required more than just open discussion. In his mind, he realized that he might need to speak out and confront this hatred that was so deeply rooted in the minds of his peers. I can't just sit here and keep quiet, he thought, deciding that he had to do everything he could to change the situation, even if it was difficult. By doing so, he would prove not only to himself, but also to all who were watching that it was worth fighting for his rights and the rights of others, despite the fear and hatred that might arise in response. The day after the attempted poisoning incident, an emergency meeting was called in the classroom. Everyone sat in anticipation, whispering and exchanging glances. As Mr. Smith entered the office, his face serious, he knew that now was the time to take action, and he needed to do it publicly so that every student would realize how important it was to condemn hate and racism. Today we need to discuss Tony's actions, he began, and there was silence in the classroom. We all witnessed what happened yesterday. It wasn't just misbehavior, it was a threat to another person's life, and this kind of behavior is unacceptable in our classroom and in our society. Tony, sitting in his seat, looked depressed. His head was down, and he couldn't meet the gazes of his classmates. A feeling of fear and shame was building up inside him. He realized that his act had crossed a line, and now he would have to be held accountable for his actions. We must show that this behavior will not go unpunished, Mr. Smith continued. Therefore, I am announcing that Tony will be suspended from school for a week and will have to take a course on racism and the consequences of hate. This is not only his punishment, it is a lesson for all of us. The teacher's words came out of the blue. Some of the students whispered, debating whether it was right to punish Tony so severely, but soon there were voices of approval in the classroom, and the atmosphere began to change. Everyone realized that this was not just a punishment, but an opportunity to learn, to understand, and perhaps even to change their point of view. The hatred that was shown yesterday must not be repeated, Mr. Smith added, looking at the class. We must become a society that supports each other, not destroys each other, and this lesson applies to each and every one of you. It's a chance to rethink your actions and words. Michael Saturday, listening to this moment, he understood that Tony's punishment was not only a step toward justice, but also an opportunity for the entire class to reflect on their behavior. He felt that this could be the beginning of change. It's not just about Tony, he thought. It's about all of us. We need to sort out our preconceived notions and learn to be more tolerant. As the discussion continued, many of the students began to speak openly about the importance of standing up against hatred and discrimination. It was a moment of unity as the class seemed to come together in the fight against racism and prejudice. Even though what was happening was hard, it gave hope that together they could create a fairer and safer place for everyone. Thus, the public punishment was not only a rebuke for Tony, but also a lesson for everyone in the class. It was the beginning of the realization of the importance of fighting hate, and perhaps it is this moment that will inspire them to make changes. In the future, after Tony's public punishment, there was a difficult atmosphere in the classroom. Although most of the students condemned his actions, deep down some began to realize that their own attitudes and inaction may have played a role in what had happened. Mr. Smith's words of hate and prejudice hung in the air like shadows, causing everyone to question their own behavior. In the corner of the classroom sat Lisa, one of those who used to laugh eagerly at Tony's jokes. Now, after his punishment, she felt the glare of her conscience on her. Why didn't I say anything then? She thought, replaying in her head the moments when Tony had teased Michael. How could I have laughed at that? Shame rolled over her in waves like a merciless sea, pushing up thoughts of her complicity in the hatred. She turned her gaze to Michael, who, although looking more confident after the teacher's intervention, still felt the pressure of judgment and fear. I don't know how we took it, Lisa pondered. How could someone do that to a person just because of their skin color? Meanwhile, on the other side of the classroom, Jake, another student who had also laughed at Tony's jokes more than once, tried to justify himself. I wasn't that cruel, he told his friends, but his words sounded unconvincing even to himself. I just didn't think he'd be so upset. Still, there was a guilt stirring in his heart that was growing more unbearable by the moment. The other students realized that their acquiescence to Tony's behavior made them complicit. This feeling, like latent hatred, began to spread through the class, causing arguments and tension. "Why didn't we stop him?" whispered someone in the back of the desk. "Why didn't we say it was wrong?" Words that once seemed like common jokes now took on new life, emphasizing aggression and bias they had overlooked. Discussions became increasingly emotional, and soon images began to surface like flashes in their minds. Conversations about how black people can play on our team, and barbed remarks about how they always act like that. These memories, now presented in their true light, caused the students to feel disgusted with themselves. Michael, realizing that his classmates were beginning to realize their mistakes, felt both joy and anger. He knew this process was necessary for change, but the hatred and prejudice he faced left a deep mark on his soul. Why is it so hard to just be good people? He asked himself as the internal conflict between hope and pain continued to plague him. With each new realization, with each new word of regret, shame covered the class like a heavy blanket. It was the beginning of change, but it also showed how deeply rooted the biases were. For some, it was simply the first step toward understanding. For others, it was the beginning of a long journey toward redemption and changing their perceptions. As the tension in the class peaked, Mr. Smith decided it was time for an important talk. He stood in front of the class, gathering their attention. His face expressed not only sternness, but genuine concern about what had happened. He knew that this was a critical moment that could either destroy or, conversely, unite them as a community. Today we have witnessed how hatred and bias can manifest itself in the most unexpected forms. He began, his voice full of strength and determination. But we need to realize that this is not just an accident. This is a systemic problem that we must confront. Each of us must take responsibility for what happens around us. He looked around the class, making each student think about their actions and words. Equality is not just a concept. It is the foundation upon which our society should be built. It's wrong to think that hate is a joke or that prejudice is okay. Every one of us has the right to dignity, and it's our job to protect that right for everyone. Some students began to realize their role in creating this hateful atmosphere. Smiles they shared earlier were now rare. Mr. Smith continued, "Racism isn't just about what we say or do. It's about what we don't say when we are silent. Your silence can sustain hate, and that's why it's important to speak up." The class began to buzz, and some students began to whisper, discussing their mistakes. There was a new energy in the air, full of hope, but also anxiety. Everyone realized that there was a long road ahead. I want you to realize that racism is not just an individual problem. It's a societal disease. And if we want to be part of the solution, we need to start with ourselves. With that knowledge comes responsibility. We need to learn, speak up, and most importantly, act. Mr. Smith added, emphasizing the importance of taking active steps towards change. Michael, listening to his teacher's words, felt a new sense of power awaken inside him. Maybe together we can make a difference, he thought, realizing that their class was facing a serious challenge. There was hope in his heart that this could be the beginning of something meaningful. Mr. Smith concluded his speech by encouraging the students. Today we have a chance to be better. This is our class, and I hope we can all learn something valuable from it. Together we can create a classroom where everyone feels safe and respected. These words left a mark in the hearts of the students, and they began to realize that each one of them could become an agent of change. From that moment on, they not only witnessed but also became active participants in the fight against hatred and racism, deciding that they would use their voices to advocate for those in need. When Tony returned home after his actions were exposed, there was hopelessness in his soul. He knew his life would never be the same again. Ever since news of his attempted poisoning spread through the school, his reputation had been ruined. He was no longer the boy they knew him to be. He was now a symbol of hatred and cruelty. When his family heard about the incident, they were shocked. The mother, had always been proud of her son, couldn't hold back tears when she heard that her boy, who was everyone's favorite just yesterday, had become the object of condemnation. "How could you, Tony?" she asked, her voice trembling with pain and anger. "How could you do that to another human being just because of his skin color?" His father, usually calm and poised, was furious. He shouted at his son, trying to understand how he could have fallen into such anger. "Not only have you undermined our family, but you have betrayed all the values we taught you," he blurted out as his voice echoed around the empty room, like a slap in the face. Those words left Tony utterly dejected. He realized that his actions had not only ruined his life, but had also caused his parents deep disappointment. At school, even though several days had passed since the incident, the discussion continued. The students were divided between those who supported Tony and those who condemned him. Even those who had once been his friend now shunned him, trying to avoid contact. The realization that they had witnessed something so horrible made his classmates look at him with distaste. Each time he entered the classroom, silence enveloped the room, and Tony felt his isolation becoming more and more palpable. One day, he heard a group of students discussing him around the corner of the hallway. "He's out of his mind," one of them said. "Did he really think he could just poison someone and get away with it?" Another replied, "I hope he has a very hard time now. He chose this path himself." These words cut his soul like a knife. He realized that not only would he have to face the consequences of his actions, but also the consequences in his relationship with others. The fear and hatred he had sown came back to him with triple the force. With each passing day, he felt himself and his humanity being lost, sinking into the darkness of isolation and shame. Tony was now forced to face reality. His actions were no mere accident. They had tragic consequences not only for him, but for everyone around him. He realized that he had a long road to recovery, if, indeed, he could ever recover what had been lost. But the worst part was that he himself had become a victim of his hatred, and now he had to find a way to heal in a world that had turned its back on him. After Tony's incident, the school administration realized the need for urgent action. Teachers, tutors, and even parents gathered in an emergency meeting to discuss how to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Mr. Smith, who became the face of this struggle, was determined to change the atmosphere at the school. He realized that it was within their power to not only identify bias, but to eradicate it. At the assembly, he proposed a series of lessons and workshops on racism, bias, and respect. "We need to teach our students to not only recognize bias, but to actively challenge it," he said. "It's not just a lesson about hate, it's a lesson about becoming better people." The administration agreed to his proposal, and soon the school began teaching classes on the subject. Teachers prepared materials ranging from historical facts about racism to contemporary examples of discrimination. Students were engaged in discussions where everyone could express their opinions, ask questions, and, most importantly, begin to reflect on their actions and words. In the first lesson, the students sat in a circle, their faces expressing tension. They knew they would be discussing the Tony incident, and many were ashamed of their previous views. Mr. Smith began with a story about the struggle for equality, telling of those who risked everything for justice. He gave examples of famous movements and personalities who inspired change. The teacher then invited the students to share their thoughts. Some bravely confessed their misconceptions, while others slowly opened up, realizing that racism is not just a word, but a real issue that affects people's lives. The discussion evoked strong emotions. Some girls cried as they remembered how their own words could hurt others. The classmates began to form new bonds as they tried to understand each other. They discovered that behind the preconceived notions were real stories full of pain and fear. Students who used to make fun of Tony were now trying to realize how their behavior might have affected his life. This realization was the beginning of change within the class. Each lesson raised new issues and provided space for discussion. Teachers encouraged pupils to think about how they could support their peers and create a more welcoming school environment. The Equality Poster Project was particularly successful, with pupils enthusiastically drawing and writing about what it means to be kind to each other. Over time, the school began to change. Students became more sensitive to issues of racism and prejudice. They began to speak out against aggression, creating support for each other. This initiative also strengthened team spirit and unity within the class, which helped to overcome prejudice. Mr. Smith knew that change would not happen right away, but he was full of hope. his heart filled with pride as he saw students begin to open up and change. A realized that fighting bias was a long road, but every step was important, and his efforts were already bearing fruit. After Tony tried to poison him, the black boy, Jason, found himself in the center of turbulent emotions. There were mixed feelings in his soul: fear, sadness, and anger, intertwined with some incomprehensible sense of victory. He understood that it was on the verge of losing his life, but at the same time, he realized that thanks to his teacher's intervention, he had avoided tragedy. On the one hand, the fear never left him. Every morning as he got ready for school, his heart pounded faster and he felt a slight tingling in his stomach. Thoughts that someone might hurt him again kept him on his toes. He noticed how his classmates sometimes cast wary glances at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still discussing the day when his life might have changed forever. On the other hand, Jason felt that his voice had been heard. The lessons about racism and bias that were taught in class had opened the eyes of many of his classmates. He saw some kids begin to change their behavior, genuinely remorseful for their silence during the bullying. This gave him hope and reminded him that justice could still be served. When Jason walked past the walls of equality posters, he felt proud. The artwork was a symbol that he was not alone in his experiences. He realized that his experience had helped other students reflect on their words and actions, and it filled his heart with a warm sense of victory. But nevertheless, sadness was also an integral part of his life. In the evenings, when he was alone in his room, he would reflect on how unfortunate it was that hatred still existed. He wondered questions he couldn't find answers to. Why can't people just accept each other for who we are? These thoughts troubled him, and he relived moment after moment, realizing that such hatred could still exist even in the most unexpected places. Internal contradictions kept him on his toes. He wished everyone would forget what had happened, but he also knew that these events were part of his story. Jason realized that his experience could be the beginning of something bigger, a dream that his personal struggle with bias would inspire others and contribute to a more just and friendly world. One day, when Jason was sharing his feelings with a friend, the friend told him, "You've gotten stronger. Your story matters." Those words seared into his soul. They were a reminder that despite the fear and sadness, he must not let hate cloud his light. He decided that he would fight for equality and justice, even if it wasn't easy. Jason realized that if he could handle this situation, he could help others overcome their fears and biases. After the attempted poisoning incident, Jason became the target of attention, but not just in a negative way. Students who had not previously noticed the bias and racism often displayed began to appear around him. They realized that now was the time to act and support each other, and many of them became his friends. Maya, one of the most popular girls in the class, realized for the first time the gravity of what had happened. She could no longer stand by as she watched her classmates humiliate Jason. "It's not okay," she told the class after the teacher explained the consequences of the aggression. "We can't just ignore things like that. We have to be a team and support each other." Maya's words provoked a lively reaction. Other students began to actively support her, voicing their opinions about the importance of uniting against injustice. They began to discuss how racism manifests itself not only in open attacks, but also in being ignored, in jokes, and in how classmates choose to remain silent when they see someone being hurt. Soon a real wave of change began in the classroom. Pupils began to gather in groups to organize activities aimed at combating racism. They held meetings to discuss how to create friendships between children of different nationalities and cultures. Jason could feel his fears slowly fading away, and he began to find hope for a better future. During one of these meetings, several students decided to create posters calling for equality, respect, and mutual assistance. They hung these posters around the school, and soon many students began to notice them. This became not just a protest, but a real movement for friendship and solidarity. Once in the hallway, Jason saw a group of kids laughing and discussing his new posters. There was no hatred in their voices, just a genuine desire to help. They came up to him and said, "We understand that you've been through terrible things, and we want you to know that you're not alone. We are with you." With each passing day, Jason felt old wounds healing. He didn't just become a victim, he became a symbol of change. His courage inspired others, and gradually, the atmosphere in the school began to change. Students began to actively denounce racism, unafraid to express their thoughts and feelings. They no longer hid behind indifference, but chose friendship and support. This process of unification was a real lesson for all. They realized that the fight against racism requires not only words but also action. And with each new step, they became stronger and wiser, realizing that together they can overcome any obstacle. The story of Jason and his fight against racism has come to an end, but its lessons remain in the hearts of all who witnessed the events. The school became a place where equality and respect became core values, not silent ideals. The students realized that each of them can contribute to changing society. They realized that hatred and prejudice can only be defeated when everyone unites for a common goal of peace and friendship. We conclude this story with an appeal to all viewers. Each of you plays an important role in creating a just society. Racism and bias can manifest themselves in the most unexpected ways, not only in great events but also in everyday life. Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism or bias? How did you deal with it? Your stories are very important to us and we appreciate every word you say. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more stories like this about fighting bias and the importance of equality, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. It helps us promote important topics and inspire others to make a change. Remember, you are important to us and we value each and every one of you. We wish you a good day and lots of inspiration.